man must do his bit.
Hello and welcome to another edition of The Public Interest. Joining me today is former President of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana and leader of the People's National Congress Reform, Mr. David Granger. Sir, welcome and thanks for joining me today at The Public Interest.
It's always a pleasure to be here.
Sir, today we're going to discuss Brazil's defense diplomacy, the defense relations between Guyana and Brazil over the years. And my first question to you, sir, Guyana's longest border is with Brazil, as you know, which is also the continent's largest country. What is Brazil's geopolitical significance to this country, Guyana?
Well, you said it. It's a country with the longest border, about 1,300 kilometers. Some say it's 1,600 kilometers, but it is the single longest border. And in terms of the continent of South America, it occupies about 47% of the entire continent. It is the single largest country on the continent. It has got borders with every country on the continent except two. It has got the biggest economy, the biggest population, the biggest armed forces of nearly 350,000. So it is the power, it compares itself with North America. They call United States the Colossus of the North, and they call themselves the Colossus of the South. So very little happens on the continent of South America that is not of concern to the Federal Republic of Brazil. But apart from its size, it has power and influence. And I recall not so long ago, there was a conflict between Colombia and Ecuador, and Brazil was able to broker a solution. Brazil is one of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It is one of the emerging economies, and Brazil has got hundreds of troops deployed in about 10 countries on the United Nations auspices. And of course, thousands of troops were in Haiti for several years. Things didn't work out so well there, but Brazil had the largest detachment, managed the Haitian security problem a few years ago, for several years. So Brazil is a power. And Brazil's influence has been strategic and long-term. And it is my view that some of the proposals that were advanced, not recently, but particularly on the Presidents Dilma Rousseff and Lula da Silva, were path-breaking. For example, there was the proposal for the South American Defense Council, not as an offensive military apparatus like NATO or anything else, but certainly as a defense council to protect countries on the continent, all of the countries on the continent, from transnational crime, from other transnational threats. So Brazil has played a role in the past. It has brokered solutions between countries on the continent, and I'm confident that it can continue to use its might. It has the respect, it has the clout to ensure that there is, compliance may be a strong word, but to maintain peace on the continent. I think any other country on this continent of South America would be aware of Brazil's power. And Brazil has not been an aggressor state, and it has been a model of peace, international peace, as far as Guyana is concerned. And from the time the conflict started heating up with Venezuela as a result of Venezuela's claim from the time of independence, Brazil made it clear that it was not interested in the realignment of any boundaries. I mean, for a country that has borders with 10 out of the states of this continent, once you start tinkering with borders, anything could unravel. So Brazil is not interested in any realignment of borders, and that has worked to the benefit of Guyana. that Brazil is not interested in countries squabbling and realigning borders, because eventually Brazil itself is going to be affected. So, in answer to your question, yes, Brazil's geopolitical situation and role on this continent is good for Guyana. It has helped us in the past, and it continues to be a stabilizing force.
And sir, my next question, I want to just go on two things which you've mentioned just now into my second question. It has to do with Brazil's support for Guyana, and you spoke of Brazil's might to broker peace in the region. Given those two things which you've mentioned just now, how effective or how critical is Brazil's support to Guyana with the territorial question with Venezuela?
Brazil's support is quite subtle and understated. What the Brazilians actually said is that they are not, initially, is that the country was not interested in a realignment of borders, which in a way is a form of support. Later on, as the controversy worsened, it did say that it supports Guyana's territorial integrity. But we must not look to Brazil as an aggressor nation which is going to come out to fight. Brazil, with its sheer power, says it is not interested in realignment of borders, and that is a form of support. And I would say that from about 1969, because the Rupununi Rebellion occurred in 1969, and I'm aware, because I was trained in Brazil that very year, I was aware that it was the cause of major military redeployment. At that time, the entire Amazon, it was not even a state, it was just called Amazon, it was a territory. But now you have the state of Roraima. So much of that development took place under the military government and after the Rupununi Rebellion. People don't link the two. But later on, in the mid-1980s or thereabouts, the Brazilian army, which of course at that time was the Brazilian military government, introduced something called the Calha Norte, which is the northern channel, however you translate Calha, the northern channel. Brazil has borders, about 4,000 kilometers of borders from Peru all the way to Cayenne. So Brazil started using its military might and of course developmental resources to fortify this entire northern frontier. So you can see that the 1969 revolt in Rupununi triggered major refocusing of Brazilian developmental energy, and of course it was powered by the Brazilian army at that time. So the Calha Norte project from Peru, Colombia, Venezuela, Guyana, Suriname, and Cayenne, French Guyana, was a product of that strategic thinking. So Brazil wants stability. It has got the land that it needs, it's got abundant resources, and it wants stability on the continent to develop those resources. And this is, of course, of great benefit to Guyana, because we too have the land and resources. We just want to be free of foreign interference and foreign threats. And I think in that regard, the strategic objectives of Guyana and Brazil coincide.
Sir, quickly, you visited Brazil and met two presidents, President Dilma Rousseff and Michael Temer. Two presidents, Jose Sarney and Lula da Silva, visited Guyana. What were the effects of these visits on Guyana-Brazil relations?
States touch at the summits. States touch at their summits, and summits are important. I mean, the engine room, the diplomats and the foreign services and bureaucrats and the public services have to do the spade work, but presidents have to meet face to face. And from my own experience, meeting President Dilma Rousseff and later on at the state visit to meet Michel Temer, we were able to get a good understanding, because as you know, there has been tremendous infrastructural work. Later on, or earlier, before my time, as you know, President Lula da Silva visited, and in Mr. Hoyt's time, I think President José Sarney visited. As a result of a direct result of Lula's visit, we have a bridge for the first time over the Takutu. We have a better bridge over the Takutu than we have in the Demerara. You know, so this is part of a bigger strategic scenario in which it was contemplated that there would be an initiative for infrastructural integration of South America. So in time to come, people should be able to drive from Cayenne to Suriname to Guyana to Brazil and further south into Argentina. So we're looking at a strategic picture in which, you know, this initiative for infrastructural development in South America could be pushed. But I think the economies, you know, of the major countries, particularly going into Mercosur, declined, you know, in over the last, you know, 20 years or so, and I haven't heard much of that initiative. But when you look at the other aspects of South American development, the Guyana Shield, you know, which we share with Brazil, and when we look at the strategic objectives, the creation of a zone of peace, and this is something that I discussed with these presidents when I visited. Also with President Michelle Bachelet in Chile, the zone of peace, creating a zone of peace on this continent so there will be no more war, and we can use our armed forces for the peaceful development of our nation and the protection of our people from transnational crime. So you're looking at, I think, one of the visits by Brazilian Defense Minister Jobim was the setting up of a South American Defense Council. But this didn't materialize. But again, Brazil was always concerned about the security and the stability of this northern tier of states, you know, like from Colombia right through to Cayenne. As you know, Colombia has some territorial issues with Venezuela. Guyana has territorial issues with Venezuela. Guyana has territorial issues with Suriname. I think Suriname has territorial issues with French Guyana. So Brazil is not interested in having these territorial issues become or degenerate into armed conflict. And in that regard, you know, I felt that the interaction with the presidents, certainly as president of Guyana and with President Dilma Rousseff and Michel Temer, that was a very important achievement. There was also an opening up of relations as it affected other forms of development. As you know, more recently, the Brazilian army was instrumental in building, developing projects in Region 9, the Upper Takutu, Upper Essequibo region. So it has been very fruitful, and it is a form of contact that has to be maintained at all times. You know, I know President Burnham visited, I think President Hoyt, President Jagan, President Jagdeo, and certainly myself. I'm not sure about the other presidents. But presidential summits are essential. And the summits between Guyana and Brazil presidents were productive. And they should be, it's a pattern that should be maintained.
Thank you, sir. Sir, I want to take you back to something you mentioned 2 weeks ago when you dealt with the question of Suriname. At that time, you spoke briefly of Guyana-Brazil defense and how those two countries have cooperated with defense over the years. Now, we've had visits by 3 defense ministers from Brazil here in Guyana. How effective or how have these visits influenced Guyana-Brazil defense cooperation?
Profoundly. At the personal level, you know, I was trained in Brazil since 1969. And later on, through these visits, one on the uh, Defense Minister Joby, the idea of the South American Defense Council was advanced. At that time, there was some hint of instability in the northern tier, particularly in Colombia and Venezuela. As you know, Venezuela has been going through some very tough times soon after the death of President Chavez. And then under Foreign Defense Minister Amory, we had actually signed defense agreements. And most recently, under me, at my time, we had a visit by Defense Minister Jugman. Now, these visits are supported by huge military bureaucracies. And we sign agreements, and I'm sure when you look at the history of Guyana-Brazil relations, you see a stack of agreements which have not been fully implemented. I mean, sometimes when you go back to these agreements, you see agreements with Saturday Saw about Akushians, you see agreements with Gadraj, but the defense agreements, Guyana has a strange system in which, from the time of independence, the head of government was always Minister of Defense. And when the executive presidency was introduced and the head of government became the president, because prior to that, we had a constitutional president who was not head of government, but he kept the Ministry of Defense. And of course, as president, I was Minister of Defense. It's a heavy burden to bear because the president has to be thinking about health, he has to be thinking about infrastructure, he has to think about petroleum, and sometimes a lot of decisions on defense are relegated to the Defense Force, which does not have the bureaucracy. I tried to create in my time something called a Department of Defense, so that these agreements could be handled by bureaucrats. The Army's function is essentially in the field. It has to go to the borders, it has to conduct training and exercises, it has to do everything the Army does, recruitment and that type of thing, ceremony and other functions. But you need a Ministry of Defense, and we've never had it, since independence. And I think in comparison with other countries, you can see that it is a deficiency which has to be rectified. Similarly, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs does not have a Foreign Service Institute, which continuously trains young diplomats and ensures that the staffing of the bureaucracy in the Defense Ministry, in the Foreign Ministry, is such that these agreements are acted on. So when these agreements are signed, there's no place in the Ministry of the Presidency or the Office of the President, it's called now, because there's no Ministry of Defense. Right. And in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, there's no Defense Department. So some of the agreements tend to lapse. So I would say that the Brazilians expect that when they enter into an agreement, Guyana would be able to fulfill its obligations under that agreement. And this is something that the Guyanese Guyana's administration has to pay attention to. But there have been concrete benefits. For example, to my knowledge, even at present, there are Brazilian instructors at the Guyana Defense Force Officer Cadet School. There are Brazilian instructors at the Guyana Defense Force Amphibious Warfare School, Jungle and Amphibious Warfare School. And Brazil has helped in the maintenance of our ships, because I don't know if anybody can help to maintain their sea cable. The GDF sea cable, that is a real challenge. And there have been other initiatives, I think there have been donations of non-lethal equipment, and there have been engagements for exchange of information. From time to time, senior officers, particularly in the northern regions of Guyana, would pay visits, and Brazilian naval craft, the small craft, of course, the big craft can't get past the Demerara Harbor bar, and they've been paying friendly visits almost every year. A Brazilian ship would come here, so it's a very healthy relationship. And in terms of getting things done, getting action, Brazilians have been very responsive to Guyanese requests over the years.
So Brazil's armed forces supported several defense and developmental projects here in Guyana. How has this cooperation helped us?
As I hinted a minute ago, because of the visits of the defense ministers and the exchanges with the presidents, I would say that there is a mood of cooperation. Now, any Guyanese who knows the Rupununi would know that that region is, almost expressed in Martin Carter's word, parching drought, flood. When it's dry, it's very, very dry. When it's wet, it's very, very wet. So during the dry season, and there are only 2 seasons in Rupununi, it's not like the coast. There's a long dry and a long wet season. When it's dry, the south is very, very dry. And sometimes the creeks dry up. You can actually walk across the Rupununi. You can walk across the Brazil. And for the first time in the history of South Rupununi, my administration was able to get assistance from the Brazilian, what they call BEC, the Construction Engineer Battalion. They deployed the engineers and dug 8 wells in Rupununi. And those wells are functioning up to the present day. And this is a great boon to the people of the Rupununi, that they can get water all year round. Because during the drought, some of them had livestock, sheep and cattle, and it was difficult for them to get water. And of course the crops suffered. So the Rupununi has been relieved of that cycle, that I would call it a Cartesian cycle, Martin Carter's cycle of parching, drought and flood, but with the help of the Brazilian Construction Engineer Battalion. And I do hope, I think hope is not a strategy, but it was the intention that Guyana's engineers, Guyana's Corps of Engineers, would continue that work by not just doing border patrols, but providing practical and functional assistance to the villages, which are particularly those in Rupununi. I think that is most susceptible to drought. Now that we've been having cycles like El Nino and so on, you need to have armed forces which are capable of assisting the villages during those difficult climatic circumstances.
So earlier, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier. That is, you spoke just briefly about defense agreements and cooperation between Guyana and Brazil. Now, Guyana and Brazil signed several defense cooperation or agreements. How effective has these agreements been?
I said earlier that there's no Ministry of Defense in Guyana, so this is itself problematic, because other countries expect that their agreements would be fulfilled by a partner ministry, foreign ministry, defense ministry, but there's no defense ministry in Guyana. Defense agreements are ought to be handled by the Office of the President, but there is a large input by the Guyana Defense Force itself, which is not a ministry and ought not to be tasked with ministerial duties. It's not recognized as a ministry. But in any event, the agreements have by and large been fulfilled. I cannot say what all of the agreements have been in the past, and whether they have been completely fulfilled. But for example, training. Brazil is a very highly organized country, And things are not just done by word of mouth, you know. They have to be written agreements, and these agreements go to the respective branch of the service or the respective department. Training, for example, if somebody goes in training, he becomes ill or he's killed, he's injured in a parachuting accident. You know, these are not things that you could just pick up a phone and solve. You know, there have to be agreements on how the body is brought back or how the person is treated. So there are written agreements, and over the years, we've been, Guyana's been trying to ensure that there's some transfer of technology. That is why at the Officer Cadet School and the Jungle Warfare School, rather than sending cadets to the Brazilian Military Academy at Agulhas Negras and sending officers and soldiers to the Jungle Warfare School at Manaus, instructors could come and develop the capabilities of those schools, through transfer of technology to Brazilian expertise. So I would say that they have been highly successful, and more could be done if we had, a Department of Defense which was interacting continuously with the Brazilian ministries. But as I said, that has never happened, and we did try to set up this Department of Defense, but it is, it is something which is still left to be done. Still a work in progress.
So I have quite a few more questions to you, but I'll just ask two more in the interest of time as we wind down today's proceedings. My next question to you, sir, maybe I'm asking you maybe to compare. In your fourth year as president, relations between Guyana and Brazil, I would say it was at an all-time high. It was strong. We saw visits in the fourth year. Now, the fourth year of this administration, this is PP administration, it seems to not engage Brazil that much in their fourth year in office. In your estimation, sir, maybe I'm not asking you to compare, maybe I am, but in your own estimation, have Guyana and Brazil relations cooled in the last 12 months?
Well, they certainly have not warmed. I know there was a video conference between the two foreign ministers, but what was frightening was the withdrawal of the ambassador and the fact that he has not been replaced. Now, I think the whole world knows what happened last week when two major countries had a spat and one withdrew the ambassador from the other's capital. That is a mark, that's a sign, that's a signal of disfavor. And in international relations, you don't recall your ambassador, you don't withdraw the ambassador without good reason. And worse still, you don't fail to replace that ambassador, for several months. So it is a sign that things have cooled. If it was a mistake, it must be corrected very quickly. It sends a bad message to a country with which we have enjoyed, very warm relations for over half a century. I don't know the reason, but I think it is clear that the ambassador has been withdrawn and he has not been replaced. It is a principle of Guyana's foreign policy that at all times the three frontier states must have Guyanese ambassadors. There must be an ambassador in Paramaribo, there must be an ambassador in Brasilia, there must be an ambassador in Caracas. And it's baffling that we do not have an ambassador in Brasilia. In fact, under my administration, we actually started the construction of an embassy. And of course, we didn't have money before. I don't know if we have money now. But these three countries are the foundation of our international relations, Guyana with Brazil, Suriname, and Venezuela. And I hope that if it's a mistake, it's corrected very quickly.
In wrapping things up, sir, finally, you spoke at length of Guyana and Brazil relations over the past 53 years. What is the way forward for Guyana and Brazil relations?
I have often described Guyana as a continental country with Caribbean characteristics. We are part of the continent. That cannot be changed. As I said at the start, you can choose your friends, but you can't choose your neighbors. Yes, we are also the headquarters of CARICOM, but in that sense, we are a bridge between the Caribbean and the continent. But we cannot cease to be continental, and we must understand our continental destiny, and we have to embrace relations with Brazil. And in future, we hope that relations with Suriname and Venezuela improve. So once we accept that continental destiny, we must accept that our relations with Federative Republic of Brazil are pivotal, and it is something that should not be ignored. And I would urge the government of Guyana to re-engage with Brazil, not only for defense and security purposes, but also for the development and the well-being. Because look, in early days, when there were issues in the hinterland, Brazilian garimperos, and Brazilians are still coming over the border. You can go to some parts of Georgetown, and they're Brazilian restaurants. I don't know exactly how many Brazilians there are in the country, but there were 30,000 Venezuelans, and I was, from my reading, I think there were at least 20, a similar number of Brazilians. Many of them are occupied in mining and other businesses, but you know very well the hotels and the restaurants and the other places that Brazilians have. So the relations between the two countries are intertwined at the social level, at the political level, at the military level, and at the governmental level. And I would urge that this administration does everything to make sure that those relationships continue to contribute to Guyana's national security.
Sir, it's always a pleasure to have a conversation with you. And to you, our viewers, we say thank you very much for joining us on today's edition of The Public Interest. Please remember to follow all COVID-19 protocols. As usual, we would also advise you to kindly share the link for today's edition of The Public Interest, or if you don't have the time to watch it today, you can always watch a rebroadcast on Sunday. Until next time, stay well and goodbye.